Hello everyone. I'm here to discuss with you leadership at St. Regis School, where we have Mr. Sample, the principal, and his employees. When introducing the case, I have the details of the school and how it is located in a rural area that's 25 miles away from the nearest city. The school has 420 students, 20 teachers, 1 library media specialist that also serves as a computer laboratory teacher. Her name is Ms. Lynn. Funds are typically limited even after 2 annual fundraisers hosted each year. And the funds that are raised, they're raised by parental and community support, and they're allocated towards first and foremost basic educational needs, then delegated to purchase new technological resources for students at the school. Mr. Sample serves as a principal for St. Regis School and has worked hard towards building relationships with staff and parentals. Mr. Sample would like to maintain the respect he has earned, but a recent dilemma may jeopardize his relationship with some of the staff at the school and its community supporters. The PTA and school faculty have decided to build a computer laboratory that allows staff and students access to 20 computers, with also the agreement to purchase software programs needed over the following 2 years. Without knowledge of copyright law or concern for it, teachers requested Mrs. Lynn to make copies of software programs that are not yet available for use on each computer. Before consulting with Mr. Sample, Mrs. Lynn made the decision to order blank copies of CDs with the intent to copy the software illegally. Once copies were made, Mrs. Lynn distributed among teachers as they had previously requested. Among the recipients of copyrighted materials, Mrs. Williams was delighted, but Mrs. Brandon was immediately concerned. Having been educated on the copyright laws and its penalties, Mrs. Brandon brought her concerns to Mr. Sample. Despite being told that the acts were of criminal behavior and could be punishable by law, Mrs. Young argued that she was doing what was right by the students and with the support of the PTA. Personally, no one has been harmed by the action of Mrs. Lynn and other teachers as of yet. However, the school has been put at risk, which also puts the students at risk. According to Mr. Sample, which was spoken to Mrs. Lynn, I must make you aware that what you are doing is a violation of copyright and will mean serious consequences for the school district, and you if discovered by the publisher. Mrs. Lynn was then ordered to cease making copies and collect the copyrighted materials. The Copyright Act of 1976 prohibits unauthorized use of copyrighted material for profit or public display without appropriate payment to or permission from the copyright proprietor. Under the Act, the owner of the copyright has the exclusive right to do and to authorize any of the following. Number 1 is to reproduce the copyrighted work in copies. Keep in mind, they have to have the rights. Teachers should not reproduce copies of software for students for an original program to serve as a backup copy, because such reproduction is prohibited under the Copyright Act. What is happening here is that Mrs. Lynn, who serves as a school librarian and media specialist, who should be familiar with the copyright law, took an opportunity to infract upon that the very law to please teachers' requests and gain support of the school PTA group by convincing them that she was saving money while also servicing students in a positive way. The people that are involved in this situation that could be affected indirectly are 420 students from grades K to 8th, also the PTA committee besides the president. Those that are affected directly would be Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Williams, which is another 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Brandon, the one who brought the concerns to Mr. Sample, Mr. Sample, the principal, and Mrs. Evans, the PTA committee president. She supports Mrs. Lynn's decision. Specific regarding race, gender, and political power is unknown. It's located in a small town of St. Regis, where it St. Regis houses St. Regis School in a rural area, which is 25 miles away from the nearest large city. Population total and cultural demographics are unknown, and social and economic statuses are also unknown. The school itself appears to house or teach the majority of general educational courses. 2 teachers are mandated out of 20 for the education of special educational needs in grades K through 8. The computer lab was established for the use of all teachers and students for all grade levels. However, this particular situation is regarding 3rd grade educational objectives. The copies that Mrs. Lynn made were distributed to 3rd grade teachers. Mrs. Lynn is the offender, is an employee of the St. Regis School. Mrs. Brandon, a colleague of Mrs. Lynn, is a teacher aware of copyright restrictions put forth by the law. Mr. Sample, which is the principal of the school, and also Mrs. Lynn's supervisor. St. Regis School is part of the local school district, and St. Regis School serves as the educational foundation for the community of St. Regis. All of these are interconnected, which means that all of these listed individuals, entities, and groups will be affected by the outcome. According to the case study story, only 3 people are aware of the possible consequences of this violation, which is Mrs. Lynn, Mr. Sample, and Mrs. Brandon. According to copyright infringement penalties, the legal penalties for copyright infringement are that the infringer pays the actual dollar amount of damages and profits. In this case, it would be however much that the company lost based on the copies made. The law provides a range from $200,000 to $150,000 for each work infringed. The infringer pays for all attorney fees and court costs. The court can issue an injunction to stop the infringing acts. The court can impound the illegal works, and the infringer can go to jail. So basically, if this case was discovered and brought into the court, Mrs. Lynn could pay the ultimate price, but the school could also be the school could also be held responsible because it's part of the school district, and the school district would most likely have to provide legal representation to help keep the school's good name. In regards to copyright law and Mrs. Lynn's actions, along with her unwillingness to cooperate, I feel as though I know enough about the situation to assess and provide possible options and consequences. The first option would be to avoid making any decision or taking any action. The second option would be to hold an open meeting between Mr. Sample, Mrs. Lynn, and Mrs. Brandon. Call for a mediation and attempt to settle the misunderstanding based on limited education regarding copyright law. A third option might be to confiscate all legally copyrighted materials and suspend Mrs. Lynn pending further investigation. A fourth option might be to destroy all evidence of negligence and never speak of it again. The fifth option might be to host another school fundraiser to purchase the requested software or a site license. When evaluating the options, if the option not to do anything is chosen, then the scandal can possibly be concealed, but possible court-appointed criminal charges and punitive damages may be inflicted on the employees involved, the school, and the school district. If an open meeting is held, then money and outside involvement may be avoided. However, Mrs. Lynn might feel targeted and resistant to guidance, or the issue could be resolved and the dilemma could be titled as a learning experience, pending continuing education for other school staff. If Mrs. Lynn is placed on administrative leave pending investigation, the school will have validated consequence to show in terms of protecting the district. Also, St. Regis School could suffer the consequences of an absent staff member, which could interrupt student learning and staff dependency. If the evidence is destroyed by Mr. Sample and Mrs. Lynn is not subject to penalty, then Mr. Sample can lose trust that he worked so hard to gain. Mrs. Brandon may also choose to resign based on moral conduct. Another fundraiser would take time, volunteers, and more resources, but a community like St. Regis clearly wants what's best for their students. Choosing the best options. Sometimes in the role of leadership, tough decisions have to be made. These decisions will always negatively affect some while positively affecting others. The tough decision that will be made in this instance is to place Mrs. Lynn on administrative leave, pending an open investigation. During the investigation process, Ms. Lynn can reflect on her choices. During the investigation time, Mrs. Sample can determine whether or not Mrs. Lynn was given proper training for the role she serves at St. Regis, if her intent was malicious, or if she deserves a second chance. Mr. Sample can also develop a school policy that helps to prevent teachers and students from being a victim of copyright infringement. Pending investigation, Mr. Sample can make it clear to the school district that measures have been taken seriously in regard to the copyright infringement that occurred at St. Regis and maintain their trust. Mr. Sample can do so by stressing that he has the children, community, and school of St. Regis in his best interest while taking the time to evaluate and assess the actions of Mrs. Lynn. Considering Mr. Sample as a school administrator and principal, he would be considered Mrs. Lynn's supervisor and therefore should be able to determine Mrs. Lynn's consequence for her misconduct. When implementing my decision, first I will refer to the employer handbook in regard to the misconduct that Mrs. Lynn has chosen to withhold, including disobeying a direct order to stop copying the software. Second, I will determine her possible fine of punishment to bring to her attention. Third, I will call a private meeting between her and I. We will discuss her motives, and I will give her the opportunity to explain her reasoning for such actions. Fourth, I will explain to her that under every pretense there is almost always an alternative way, a legal one. Fifth, I will make it my duty to let her know how much I appreciate her dedication to the school and the children that it houses, but her acts cannot go unnoticed. Ultimately, when educating young minds, it is our duty to guide them on how to reflect good citizenship, and that breaking the law is not part of setting that example. 6. I will provide Mrs. Lynn with a signed copy of her discipline and provide in detail what will be investigated. She will be placed on leave until further notice. Thank you.